Okay, I'm going to go all the way around. There we go. They didn't rethink this right. Okay. All right. Stick this in here. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Steve Mull. I'm Vice Provost for Global Affairs here at the University of Virginia. And I'd like to give a warm welcome to everybody here at the Miller Center and to those watching online after that absolutely gripping presentation by Bill Browder and David Morgan. We're really privileged to have today two of the greatest and most eloquent experts on the problems of corruption facing the world today to follow up that presentation this morning after hearing the scope of this horrible problem that confronts democracy around the world. In our panel now, we're going to focus on what tools we have as people defending democracy to fight this scourge of corruption. I'm really pleased to introduce, as part of the panel today, Mr. Philip Kiefer on my far left, who is Principal Advisor of the Institutions for Development Department of the Inter-American Development Bank. He was formerly the lead research economist in the Development Research Group at the World Bank. With broad-ranging experience in countries including Bangladesh, Benin, Burkina Faso, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Peru. He has a lot to share. Phil's work has focused on political incentives to pursue economic development and to ensure public officials, in fact, work in the public interest. His research on property rights, the political credibility of governance, and the influence of political parties on public policy has been widely published and frequently quoted. In the center, we're really pleased to have Kara Brockmeyer, who currently serves as litigation partner in the prominent legal firm of Debevoise and Plimpton's Washington office, where she focuses on representing companies and individuals in anti-corruption cases, fraud, and related investigations, as well as advising on due diligence and compliance for her clients. Before she joined Debevoise in 2017, Ms. Brockmeyer served as the chief of the SEC Enforcement Division's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act unit, overseeing many of the agency's largest and most complex corruption investigations. She worked at the SEC for a total of 17 years. She was one of the principal authors of the SEC Department of Justice Resource Guide to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is widely considered the definitive government-issued guide on the FCPOA. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists. I'd like to begin this morning by asking our panelists to take a few minutes to give an overview, and then we'll move to a question, including some questions from you all in the audience. So Phil, if we could begin with you.
Great, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's also a little bit humbling to follow Bill Browder. He's fighting the good fight against corruption, and I'm studying the good fight against corruption. So I spent 25 years thinking about these issues more on the research side. So I thought I would just say a couple things about what research tells us about the problems of corruption and where they come from and what to do about them. And it's a little bit depressing. I think what you take very clearly away from Bill Browder's discussion is that the problem of corruption is really a problem of citizens' inability to control their governments. And when that is a serious problem, it's not just that the governments steal, it's that they don't provide public services, it's that they treat people badly when they go to jail, it's all these bad things happen when governments are out of control. And corruption is it is one of them, but stealing is not the only thing. So I want to return to this problem of citizen-controlled government at the end, because that's really where the rubber hits the road, but it's also the most difficult thing for outsiders to influence. Indeed, outsider influence of those things is often resisted and regarded as an infringement of sovereignty for obvious reasons. What we tend to have as tools in international organizations, for example, to fight corruption is really the kinds of things we're used to using in our country, in richer countries with well-developed institutions. The problem we're concerned about usually is the occasional person who's not acting in the interests of his organization. So he's stealing or she's stealing or something like that. So we have tools available to prevent that from happening. They tend to be things like the fiduciary responsibilities that people have, and those are written into law or into contract. And then there's organizational features that enforce those. So they could be internal audit, external audit. Then there's administrative and judicial procedures for people who violate those laws. And we try and strengthen, and so what we do in international organizations, 90% of the time, is try and strengthen those things in the countries we work in. And we do that because they're relatively unobjectionable. Countries don't tend to say no when we say, well, let's strengthen internal audit a little bit. Because a politician can always pick up a phone if he's not very happy with the results. This is not a waste of time, I have to say. So there's cool evidence out there that if you do things like audits or threaten audits, even in Indonesian villages, for example, there was a cool study by Ben Olken, and he said, let's see if the threat of an audit of a local little mayor will reduce corruption in local road building projects that are financed by USAID in this case. And so the very clever thing about this, and the very hard thing about this, was that he actually went out and used engineers to measure how deep the asphalt was, so he could directly measure the corruption. And sure enough, the threat of audit, compared to all the other things he thought to do, the threat of audit reduced corruption, but it didn't reduce corruption from they're stealing 80% to they're stealing 5%. It was more like it reduced corruption 5 or 10%. The quality of the road improved. So there was not a life-changing road to Damascus moment, but there was evidence that this is a useful thing to do. What's interesting about this is that there was no certainty that an audit would lead to something. There was just the idea that the mayor thought somebody in Jakarta now has something bad about me, and I don't know who they are, and I don't know if they hate me or not. So it's nothing organized about audits in Indonesia. The national audit function is not necessarily well undertaken in Indonesia, but you're just worried that somebody knows something. And we have the same experience. We just finished a study in Colombia where we use students from local universities to go out and see if the kids who were recipient beneficiaries of the school meals program were getting the food that they deserved. So we were in 2 departments, 2 states of Colombia. There's only 4 operators, 4 contractors getting food there, or giving out food. So this is kind of like grand corruption, because they're kind of running the show in these 2 departments. And we asked just these students going down and checking out systematically if the kids are getting the food they're getting. These are audits with no legal value whatsoever. They can't be used by government to bring charges, but they are systematic information. And the operator said, whoops, there's systematic information now out there about us not doing what we're supposed to be doing. So they changed the behavior. They actually changed the behavior, not because this was part of an official audit system, but because of fear that somebody may not like me. Like the political deals I've made may break down, I'm not sure, so for now I'm going to fix things up. But in all these, so there's evidence like this all over the place of audits working for some narrow purpose. There's very little evidence of those kinds of reforms taking off and going to other parts of government, or of changing things in the long term. They work while they're there, and they don't spread. So anti-corruption doesn't spread the way the corruption sort of spreads. The other interesting thing about this, which I think we see throughout history, including in this country, is that these are always efforts to audit lower level people or lower level governments. We have really very little evidence or even experience with reforms of the central audit function of central government people. I don't know of a case where there's been some big reform of audits and all of a sudden legislators and presidents became less corrupt. I'm just not aware of any experience like that in developing countries. So let me just switch to the problem of citizens. Sorry if I just stop me, but this is a really big deal. Think of the problem you have when you want to, this is just a tremendous challenge of governing a society. And that's why not very many societies have succeeded for a very long time in sort of governing themselves, in making sure that law and order is provided, public goods are provided, government officials don't steal. That is rare in the world. It's not common in the world. It's hard to govern ourselves. We as human beings have a hard time governing ourselves. And the problem of corruption in particular is symptomatic of that. So now you're the average, you're a voter in Indonesia or in Colombia or whatever, and you have a choice between some guy who you know stole, but he might have given you something, and versus some other guy who says he won't steal, and you might believe him, but you're not sure he's going to give you anything. You're not sure that he will represent any particular policy, line of policy. You're not sure he's a left-wing guy, a right-wing guy. You're not sure if he really can deliver public goods and better schools. So you say, well, that's a terrible choice. And so you regularly say, I'll take the guy I know, even though he steals. But it's worse than this. Say that you do have a choice. What else happens in these countries? You need, as a voter, to rely on all the other voters to sort of go with the flow. They also have to make this same judgment. I'm not going to vote for that corrupt guy. I'm going to switch to the good guy, because otherwise you're wasting your vote. So what do these politicians in some of these countries do? So this is an experience in the Philippines we had. We gave all this information, my last story, and then I'm done. We gave all this information to these, to regular people in all these villages in the Philippines. And the information was only this. The mayor of your municipality has this big program that's funded by the national government to build things like schools, roads, do agricultural extension, like 10 things. We told them, we gave them flyers, these 10 things. That's what we told them. We didn't say anything about what their mayor had done. We just said, this program exists and this is what it does. What happened after that? This was like 2 weeks before the election, 3 weeks before the election. Well, as far as we can see, they looked around and they said, nothing. Got nothing here. 10 things we could have had, I don't see anything. So they were all of a sudden disappointed in the incumbent mayor. So that's a good thing. They're disappointed, they're going to vote him out, and this is going to lead to change. No, the incumbent mayor is a smart guy. So he said, these are disappointed people. So he said, well, I'm just going to have to buy their votes a little more. So the people who got our flyers got something from the mayor. They actually did. What they got was vote buying. And that vote buying was so effective that the support for the mayor in the places that received our flyers was the exact same as the support for the mayor in the places that did not receive our flyers. This is not a bad outcome for those people, so I don't feel bad that our flyer caused this weird thing to happen. We did not anticipate this, and if we told an institutional review board beforehand that this might happen, we might not have been able to do it, but I don't feel bad because these people got more stuff. They got stuff they would not have gotten otherwise. So that's a good outcome. This is not an outcome that tells you but it's also an outcome that tells you how difficult it is to organize society so citizens can demand that their politicians perform well.
Thanks, thanks very much,
thanks,
Phil.
Thanks, Steve.
Speaking of tools, we're so happy to have you here, Kara. I have to tell you, in
Thanks,
all
Steve.
of my years in diplomacy, if I ever wanted to get the attention of a business audience, all I would have to do is say FCPA,
right?
and the room would go silent,
Yep.
and people would be completely out of attention. So we'd love to hear a little bit about your perspective about one of these most powerful tools.
Sure. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I actually want to say that I am not as hopeless about corruption and what the U.S. and people in this audience can do. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of my experience. So I've been doing FCPA cases since 2005, and I don't know how many people are familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but just a little bit of background. The U.S. became the first country to adopt a law that basically made it criminal for companies to bribe foreign government officials in 1977. It came out of Watergate, and we'll see if what we have coming out of what's going on right now. And one of the key things, picking up on what Phil said, was actually transparency. So there are two parts to the FCPA. The first part prohibits bribery. The second part requires public companies to keep accurate books and records and have adequate internal controls. Now, you may have been surprised as I was when I found that out, that it wasn't until 1977 that public companies in the US, meaning companies that trade on a stock exchange, that there was a specific statutory requirement that they have adequate books and records. But it went into place as part of the FCPA. Now, one of the interesting things about the FCPA is that unlike a lot of securities laws, jurisdiction is divided between the SEC and the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice has criminal jurisdiction over public companies, and then it has civil and criminal jurisdiction over the other categories of actors that are subject to the FCPA. So private companies based in the US, US nationals, and any foreign national who's stupid enough to come to the US and violate the act while they're in the territory of the US. The SEC has civil jurisdiction over issuers, and it's an unusual statute. There aren't very many like that. And the reason is because the SEC was primarily responsible for pushing Congress to adopt the FCPA. And the interesting thing is, the head of the enforcement division at the time, Judge Stanley Sporkin, told Congress he didn't care if the SEC could enforce the bribery provisions. He was fine if they left that to the criminal authorities. He wanted the ability to enforce the books and records and internal controls provisions because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And it was his view, and this is right, that if you forced companies to put on their books the slush funds that they were holding off their books that they were using for bribes, the public perception in the US of the shareholders would prevent companies from doing that. So, all right, fast forward. So the FCPA was in place for 20 years. There was no other country in the world that had a similar law. In fact, some of the US's biggest trading partners, like Germany and Japan, it was actually a legitimate business expense that you could deduct, the bribes that you paid to foreign officials. So in 1998, the US went to the OECD and said, okay, we have to do something about this. And so what happened in 1998 was the OECD created the Convention on Anti-Bribery, which is modeled after the FCPA, and created a working group on bribery that is a very strong peer group with a peer review mechanism, and I'll talk about why that's so important in a minute. And basically said every country that is an OECD member or wants to become an OECD member has to join the working group on bribery and has to accede to the convention. So they have to have laws in place that are similar to the laws that the US has. Great, 1998, you would think, okay, problem solved. No, for another 15 years, there's almost no enforcement by anyone else other than the US. But even the US was not significantly enforcing the laws. So until 2008, the largest case the US had ever brought under the FCPA was a $15 million fine against a company called Titan, right? $15 million for a huge company. Not a lot of deterrence there. That all changed in the late 2000s. So in 2008 and 2009 with a series of cases. And this is actually how I first started doing these, because I had been at the SEC for a number of years doing everything the SEC did, particularly loved accounting cases. And then in 2005, I became an assistant director, which meant I took over a group of 15 attorneys that were doing all types of investigations. One of the investigations in that group that had just begun was an investigation into potential bribery in Nigeria over a project called Bonny Island. It was a 4-company joint venture, Halliburton and its subsidiary KBR, ENI, which is the big Italian company, Technip, the big French company, and JGC, which is a huge Japanese oil company. These 4 companies had a JV to build what are called LNG trains in Nigeria to get liquefied natural gas out of the country. And there were allegations that they had paid bribes. This investigation was just beginning when I took it over, and I have to say, it was a fabulous introduction to what the FCPA world is like on the enforcement side and what it can be. I mean, the facts of that case were just like a movie. We had a crooked lawyer in the UK that had $100 million sitting in a bank account. We had hundreds of millions of dollars frozen in Swiss bank accounts. There were shady middlemen. There were notebooks full of meetings with code names on who was getting paid. There were bags of cash, literally bags, captain's bags of cash paid. And in all, there were 3 successive sitting presidents of Nigeria, plus a whole slew of other officials that were bribed over a period of 10 years. So that case, which was happening we were investigating that in 2005, brought the first action against Halliburton and KBR in 2009, was happening at the same time another massive investigation into the Siemens company was happening, which is a huge German conglomerate. Those 2 cases, back to back, the Siemens case was a $1.6 billion sanction brought against Siemens by the US and the Germans in December of 2018. In February of 2019, the SEC and DOJ filed civil and criminal actions against Halliburton and KBR, charged them $500 million. So we went from 15 million to $500 million to $1.5 billion. By the time the investigation into the 4-company joint venture was done, it was $2.1 billion that had been collected. That changed the calculus immensely for any company that was subject to the FCPA, because now all of a sudden it wasn't a cost of doing business, it actually had teeth. And that had a significant impact on the way that American businesses viewed their conduct and the amount of resources that they put into things like compliance programs, like going out to their foreign subsidiaries and saying, it is not okay to make small payments, it's not okay to make large payments. We need to start doing due diligence on our third parties. We need to have control over our supply chain. So 2008, 2009, that was the start in the US of the rise of what we call the modern era of FCPA enforcement, where it suddenly became a law that US companies, but not just US companies, because it impacts any company that trades its stock on the US stock exchange or that has a subsidiary here in the US that is engaged in the conduct. So it reaches, because the stock market is so huge, it reaches a lot of companies around the world. So we go from that. In 2011, I took over as the head of the FCPA unit. It was a relatively new unit. It had been established about 10 months before. DOJ also has a unit that focuses on this. Now, why does that matter? All right, think about it. If you are a prosecutor in the middle of a country, US or anywhere, and all of a sudden something lands on your desk, it's a whistleblower complaint saying a company in your backyard is bribing officials in Uganda. You look at this and you're like, okay, I'm in Hungary. What the heck do I do with that? How am I going to investigate something that's happening in Uganda, right? International corruption, by its nature, requires international cooperation. So one of the things that was very clear was that all the way through in the early 2000s, the US was still far and away bringing more cases than anyone else in the world, right? Which made it very easy for companies and everyone else to say, well, this is just the US, out there doing this stuff. So one of the things that we did when I was the head of the unit with the DOJ, and has continued today, is really work on improving the amount of international cooperation and international enforcement. And so things like, for example, FATF, and we're going to talk about that, and the anti-money laundering laws, and the anti-terrorism laws, and the bank secrecy, attacking the bank secrecy laws. So why does that matter for anti-corruption? Because one of the biggest ways that you prove that corruption occurred, you have to trace the money, right? You have to find the bank accounts. It was a sea change when Switzerland started cooperating with the US and providing information about who the beneficial owners were of those numbered Swiss bank accounts. I can't tell you how big a game changer that was. The power of sitting there with a company that says, yeah, I know our third party we paid a lot of money to a third party and we can't really tell you where it went, but we have no indication, no evidence that it went to a government official, and you put the Swiss bank account up there that was opened with the official's official government passport identifying his position in the government. That's a powerful moment, right? That changes the way that people think, can I get caught or not? Which is really what you're trying to do. And so we've really seen, now, is there enough international enforcement and international cooperation? Absolutely not. But it's a question of, is the glass half full or is it half empty? There's a lot more now than there ever was in the past. Is there enough? No. But one of the things that I used to tell people when we would go around working through the OECD and through the World Bank is really, the World Bank in and of itself really changed the way that it enforced these laws and has very powerful, the World Bank, the development banks have very powerful tools themselves because they can debar companies from participating. That's huge. Those tools working together in a way that they never have before. This is an area where I think it's really 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You have to take the long term. You can't let yourself be sort of disappointed or discouraged in the short term. You have to take the long-term view that as long as the trend is positive, eventually we're going to get there.
Thanks very much, Kara. If I could just follow up, back before he became president, President Trump described the FCPA as a horrible
law. Yep.
And so,
yes.
So when Attorney General Sessions was going through the confirmation process, that comment, of course, aroused a lot of interest from the Senate as to whether or not the Trump administration would be committed to it. And in his hearing, he pledged that as Attorney General, he in fact would fully enforce the law. So how's the Trump administration doing?
So what I will say is this, there has, despite what the pundits expected, there has actually been no change in the way that the US enforces the FCPA. And that's because of the professionalism and the dedication of the career prosecutors, the career regulators at the Department of Justice, at the US Attorney's offices, at the SEC, who are not swayed by politics, they're not swayed by the political appointees. We haven't seen a drop-off in the number of cases brought, in the number of significant penalties, both monetary penalties and other forms of penalties. In fact, the Justice Department has become more aggressive now than it ever has in the past at charging individuals. In fact, this fall, they have a total of 7 cases that are going to trial. They had 2 cases that were on trial that for the last few weeks that have been on trial together, which for the Justice Department is huge. These cases are very time intensive. So the good news is the line prosecutors and the regulators are continuing to do their job.
Oh, great. That's good news. Phil, I was wondering if I could follow up on your anecdote about the efforts to use corruption in political campaigns in the Philippines. And when you look around the world, this year there's been an eruption of various protest movements around the world in Hong Kong, Venezuela, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Haiti, most of which have been focused on socioeconomic discontent writ broadly, complaints about the concentration of too much political power. And at the same time, we've seen election campaigns this year in the last few months in places like Hungary and Poland, where there have been credible allegations of corruption, yet the ruling parties sailed on to victory. So does that mean that voters are less concerned about allegations of corruption? Do you find that it's less of an organizing motive in political campaigns?
I don't think any voter anywhere thinks that it's great if a politician steals, but they just have a lot of things on their plate. So in Chile, half the economy is controlled by about 12 families. And it's hard to rise up in Chile. So there's inequality and issues like that they're reacting to. In Hong Kong, it's even worse, actually. So and it's twofold. One is the colonial issue, and the other is economic opportunity in Hong Kong, when large families, or probably small families, control lots of land. So I think corruption is not the main issue in these countries. The main reason we worry about corruption, the main reason I worry about corruption in elections is it can be used to disorganize and fragment an opposition. That's what vote buying is doing. Vote buying is saying, I know you want to vote for the other guy, but I want you to vote for me, and here's some money to do it. And if everybody knows that everybody is going to be given that offer and may take it, nobody's going to vote for the good guy. And I actually think that's not, at least money is changing hands and going to voters. So that's a good thing. I think the worst, at least citizens are getting something out of this. The worst thing is when media is controlled and an opposition are thrown in jail, and these are the really terrible things that are worth protesting about. So I'm in awe of these Hong Kong kids, and I'm in awe of the Mardan, the Ukrainian, and I'm in awe of Tahrir Square. These people are really putting their life on their line. Mm-hmm. But I'm just depressed about how relatively easy it is to get a demonstration going, and even to sustain it for a few months, but how hard it is to turn that into a real opposition party that can elect leaders. It's hard to be organized. And the reason why it's hard to be organized is an organization needs an organizer. An organizer can be identified and can be co-opted or coerced. This is why it's, I don't know. It's better to talk to Kara, because it's like, she
I think we're talking like big picture versus small picture.
No,
right?
but
I also know what you can do.
But I also think I kind of think the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is an expression of American values.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I doubt it's good for American GDP, because I think if it's easier to do business in another country, it probably brings you more profits and more jobs than if you can't do business in another country.
That's why China doesn't enforce their law.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm not sure it's bad. I'm not sure it helps the countries who can no longer do business with American companies, because they can do business with others. Countries in East Asia, right, who are not really signatory to this. There's a lot of companies that will fill the gap. But I just think it's important for us as a country to say, this is not what we will do. We will take a hit, We will take a hit because this is not who we are.
So let's pick up on that about American values and the American role in confronting this problem. Both of you have spoken about American leadership over decades in shaping an international consensus to fight corruption through these various tools. So I can tell you the past few years have not been particularly easy for American diplomats working overseas, as the ledger of allegations about corruption in our own country has gotten longer and longer, whether it's about President Trump's visiting his various properties more than 360 times since he became president and giving the bill to the taxpayer for that. His suggestion of using his own hotel to host the next G7, later withdrawn, but the damage was done. The institutional withdrawal of the United States from such things as the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which has been a huge tool in getting voluntarily mining companies around the world to engage in less corrupt practices. And the U.S. taking the diplomatic initiative to shut down UN efforts to investigate corruption in Guatemala, for example. So does all of this together, does it make it harder for the U.S. To serve as a leader in fighting corruption? Is there hope that we can somehow hang on to that leadership role? I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Want me to go first?
Please.
Okay, so I'll go first. I'll say, so first of all, let me start by saying I think the U.S. has never had a problem telling other countries, do as I say, not as I do, right? I will say that I think it's a very challenging time for people in government. I have a lot of friends that are still in government. There was a reason why I left in 2017. There's probably a reason why you left as well. It does make it more difficult, but I actually think it's a good learning moment, because I think there were a lot of us in America, myself included, who did not envision that we would be in this position. And I think it's a good reminder for everyone that no matter how strong your democracy and how strong you believe that it is, you still have to be on guard all the time. So I don't see any other country that is taking the mantle right now, but I do think it's more difficult now than it was in prior years to say you shouldn't go around and do these things.
It's hard for me to talk about specifics, but I think I just want to second that the social compact is not necessarily always robust. It can be fragile, and I think words matter because words sort of establish the norms, right? So you reinforce the norms of a society through the things we say and not only the things we do. Mm-hmm. That's just true in life in general, right? It's what we teach our kids. It's like, so that's fine. But the broader point is when push comes to shove, people will choose. When push comes to shove, strong institutions are not vote getters. When push comes to shove, great audits and integrity are not vote getters. People will always default to the politician who I think most identifies with me, or the politician who I think really understands the issues that I confront. And in the US, it's quite, there was Angus Deaton and his co-authors put out a shocking report about the life expectancy of middle-aged men who only had a high school degree. So suicide rates are incredibly high, drug addiction incredibly high, and death incredibly early. So that's a big change in US society. And I think we see a lot of Americans who see their lives as having problems that are not being addressed. And if they see someone who is thinking about their problems, they will put in second place the things that we are worried about.
One of the things that I've often thought is that I think, to me, and I'm not an economist, so I will defer to Phil. One of the things that I think changes the calculus in a country on whether they're going to tolerate corruption or not is the rise of the middle class. The rise of a group of relatively educated people who have something to lose, who are basically saying, we've had enough of the petty corruption, we've had enough of the grand corruption. And then I think it is my, possibly uninformed view is it is the middle class and the health of the middle class that keeps a society stable.
That has to be true. The question is what causes what, and I'm not sure. I think we're still debating. Do you need a good society to get a good middle class, or is the middle class the foundation of a good society? That's the
Phil, both you and Kara have mentioned the value of punitive tools to motivate better behavior among public officials. Are there carrots also, Phil, in your experience, that can encourage good public governance, resisting the forces of corruption?
That's interesting. I think if you look at if you just look at societies that are not corrupt, let's just think the Nordic societies, for example, Nordic countries. They're kind of widely regarded as just high scoring on social capital, high scoring on trust, high scoring on integrity. It's so great. So there's two observations I have about that. One is they do not rely on the heavy hand of fiduciary responsibility and audits and they have it. I mean, for tax, because they have a high tax state, so they will take a lot of care with tax. But you don't feel, as a civil servant in a Nordic country, you don't feel like you are every action is going to be checked by some auditor. You're given discretion. Everybody trusts everybody to do the right thing. And I think we can't, as international organizations, we can't over-recommend sort of fiduciary controls as the solution to systemic corruption. Because you could just feel that in yourself. Think about yourself in a job. So you could be in a job where every moment of every day you're going to be audited on someone's, or your discretion is going to be super circumscribed, because the exercise of discretion is an opportunity to act in your own interest and not the interest of the people who've employed you. So that's a terrible job. That's a terrible life. So who's going to work, say, in the public sector in an environment where fiduciary controls are everywhere and grinding you down? It's going to be not the best people, right? And it might even not be the people who want to be honest. It might be the people you don't even know. So I think that's another reason why words matter. You want to encourage people. You want to encourage people who have the public interest at heart to work in public service. That's kind of our goal, and that's what you see in democracies that are well functioning. People with a public vocation find it convenient to work in the public sector, and if they're there, they're not going to steal because that's against their vocation. It's against their intrinsic values. So I think we kind of are looking for that. So and there's unfortunately evidence that it goes the other way, but in corrupt societies, or where corruption is high, it's not those people that go into the public sector. And indeed, there's people who do these cool experiments that our front row colleagues know better than I do. They will do, there's ways to test how likely people are to cheat in sort of a laboratory experiment. So you give them, you say, roll these dice like 40 times, roll the dice, and we'll pay you, we the experimenter, will pay you more money the more dots you get on the dice. So double six, double six, double six, you're going to be golden. You're going to get a lot of money. But the experimenter also knows what the chances are of double six, double six, double six, double six 40 times in a row. So the people will, they'll say whatever they say. So a marker of an intrinsically honest person or an intrinsically dishonest person is how far the number of dots exceeds, half. So half the total. So and then they ask what is your, and they'll do this in different countries. And then the question is, do you want to work in the public sector? So in India, I think, where the number of dots was off the charts, it was those people who said, yes, public sector for me. So, and that's not true everywhere else. So that's a tough thing.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Kara, earlier you alluded to the Financial Action Task Force, and I just have to tell you a small story. One of my previous jobs in government was being the U.S. implementer of the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah.
And it got off to a happy start, didn't end so well. And as Iran was coming into compliance, I had a very interesting conversation with my Iranian counterpart who said, let's say we do everything well and we comply and the sanctions come off and things begin to improve. What next can we do to make sure we stay on a good trajectory? And so I pulled out the example of the Financial Action Task Force. I said there are all sorts of guidelines that lay out how to not be accused of a country, of being a government that promotes money laundering. You should abide and try to associate yourself with that. And in fact, the Rouhani government began limited, flawed, but nevertheless a process to begin bringing Iran into compliance. So it was a real indication of the power of these tools in motivating a change in international behavior. Do you think FATF has much of a future? What's the next step in using this as a tool to stop money laundering?
You know, I think it's been very successful, and not just successful in stopping money laundering and terrorist financing, but as I sort of alluded to, we've seen the knock-on effects in anti-corruption, and it has helped. For example, the FCPA does not prohibit foreign government officials from taking bribes. It only prohibits the supply side, not the demand side. And if anybody's interested in why, there's a whole historical reason why. Come see me after, and I'm happy to tell you. But the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, doesn't allow that to stop them from charging foreign government officials. And they're very active doing it through anti-money laundering laws and their kleptocracy initiative. And those tools are exactly the same tools that they use. I think that when we're talking about what are the carrots, I think there actually is a benefit to sort of the peer pressure that countries feel about whether or not they are outside of the accepted bounds. Not every country is going to feel that way, obviously, but countries will. And so I think that was a good place where the international community writ large was saying these are our expectations. I think that's why, for example, in the anti-corruption space, with the OECD working group, which is a very rigorous peer review process, much more rigorous than, say, the UN does, countries have actually they've changed their laws. The UK adopted the UK Bribery Act after it got a bad review. France just adopted the Sapin-2, which is its new anti-corruption law, and actually started enforcing it for the first time. So that peer pressure, I think, actually does matter.
Terrific.
That helps a lot. For the IDB, the Latin American countries are much more willing to engage on these issues when they've signed international agreements about these things. So anti-money laundering, they're running around like crazy because they want to comply. And that's just one of many conventions, I think, that exist on corruption issues. So it's a good point of entry. I'm just not sure how deep it goes inside the way these countries operate, but it's definitely a huge point of entry where a dialogue can happen and policy change can happen.
Yeah.
Terrific. Well, let's open it up to the floor for questions. I think we have a student with a microphone, and lights are up to help.
We got a question in
here,
the front row.
Front and center. Our first question.
He wants to break the ice, right?
I'll use my prerogative as co-director of the CLEAR Lab to ask the first question. So this is a question for you, Kara. So tying together a couple of things we saw today, Vladimir Putin is not going to open a Swiss bank account with his own passport.
Right.
So in a world of sort of shell companies and trusteeships where tracking, I've actually looked at some of the Panama Papers myself, trying to do some research on that. It's insanely difficult to track the beneficial owner. Yeah. So what are the tools that we have to get at corruption in this world? So that's the first question. And a related question is, so it was really interesting to know and hear about and see in newspaper articles the fact that Switzerland is cooperating in some of these cases. So how do we try and get other countries to also cooperate with corruption investigations around the world?
Okay. So first one, you're absolutely right that the issue of unidentified beneficial ownership is a giant one. And that is one place where the U.S. is far behind a lot of other countries and takes a lot of, I think, deserved criticism for it. Whether it's the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, which were a similar set of disclosures, a lot of what I did when I was at the SEC, a lot of what I do now for my clients on the due diligence side is hire investigative firms to try to go out and figure out who are behind these shell companies, right? Because you have to figure out, is there a government official on the other end of this that is going to benefit? And it's incredibly challenging. It depends on the jurisdiction. Now, there are definitely some tools that other countries have that the US does not. So for example, there's a lot of us that are watching very closely what the UK is doing with their unexplained beneficial wealth, the unexplained wealth orders, where they have a new mechanism under the law where they basically can go to court and get an order if they see a government official or the wife of a government official who seems to have a lot of money, and government officials really never get paid that well anywhere. They can basically have an order that says you have to explain to the court where you got the money, that the money to buy the jewelry, the expensive gifts, the real estate was legitimately owned, or the court can seize that money. I think those types of mechanisms have a significant impact. I think for the US, one of the things that I think everybody in this room can do that will make a difference, there are bills pending in the Senate and in Congress right now on beneficial ownership. Senator Grassley and Congresswoman Mahoney, both of whom just won the Coalition for Integrity, which is what used to be the US chapter of Transparency International, gave them their award, their biggest award this year for those bills. So encouraging Congress to adopt those bills, I think, makes a big difference. And then the second one was, how do we encourage international cooperation, right? That is where you do a lot of the carrot and the stick. And so the US spends a lot of time working on, just on the enforcement side. So I'm talking not about what the State Department does, what all the other outreach is, just prosecutor to prosecutor, building those relationships. So for example, one of the things that the SEC and DOJ started doing back when I was there, they've continued doing it, is hosting week-long training sessions for prosecutors around the world. So they bring in, it's usually about 135 prosecutors from 60 or so different countries who come together for a week, all sit in the same room. That can be incredibly empowering for prosecutors who come from a country where they may be one of only a handful of people that are even interested in trying to do these cases, and build those cooperation measures. Because one of the things that the US has found, and so have other countries, that the formal mechanisms for cooperation between countries, which is basically the MLAT, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process, is incredibly bureaucratic. It's very, very difficult. It lands on the desk of some bureaucrat in some other country that has no incentive to help you. And that the big difference is if prosecutors can build those personal connections, that you can say, okay, you have this investigation, I have this investigation, we can help each other. So I'm gonna send the request, you make sure, you go to your Ministry of Justice and make sure my request gets answered. I'll go to my Department of Justice and make sure that yours get answered. That makes a big difference.
Yeah, they're in the back.
Yes, looking around the world, there's one country that comes to mind that was just a total mess, including corruption, and then got it completely turned around, that being Singapore.
Yeah.
Have you studied Singapore, and what can we learn from that country?
Yeah, so it's fascinating, right? Because Singapore is in Southeast Asia. It is sort of like a little beacon of light in the sense that it is viewed as not being very corrupt. And in fact, they have taken action against companies that engaged in corruption. They did a big one involving a company called Keppel with the U.S. not too long ago, which was the first time I think that they had enforced their anti-corruption laws. You know, there may be a lot of other parts about Singapore that we might not want to export. You know, it comes, right? There's a balancing act
like to chew
there.
gum. Yeah,
exactly. I think, you know, one place to watch is Malaysia because of the whole 1MDB scandal, which is their sovereign wealth fund, and the former president is, I don't think they put him on trial yet. I think he's still been charged. To see, is that for them a defining moment where they turn things around or not? There's a lot of us that are watching what's happening in Brazil because they were so far out ahead of anywhere else in Latin America in addressing anti-corruption. And you know, there's right now a backlash, and you know, people saying, "Are we better off now than we were?" I think it's very challenging. But I think that one of the things that citizens in countries can do is demand transparency from their officials and from their companies on how they spend money.
Phil, you can go ahead.
So the Singapore question is actually is super deep and hard. There's not that many examples of countries that have done that, and it feels, and you get the sense that there's some certain delicate conditions that have to be fulfilled. And in the Singapore case, one seems to be fear of Malaysia. So they need to get their act together. But then the they needs to be somehow organized in a cohesive way. So the group that is worried about Malaysia needs to be acting together. And there's a party that does that. And then everybody in the party needs to get a payoff of some kind and be happy. So they manage that as well, because salaries are extraordinarily high in Singapore. It's the Prime Minister of Singapore makes a few $1 million a year, or something like that. So they know that the society has to succeed, otherwise they're vulnerable to outsiders. And they have internal incentives to organize themselves to make that happen. So that's super impressive. Yeah, it's super impressive. There's another example of that Bo Rothstein writes about, and that's 19th century Sweden. Sort of from terrible, terrible corruption to fear of some Nordic country that was invading them or not invading them. I just don't know my Nordic history. But apparently it's not happy in the 19th century. And so they had to get their act together. And they had enough of a cohesive monarchy or who knows what to make that happen. But there's another recent example where that did not happen, and that's Ukraine. Right? So there's no cohesive set of oligarchs that kind of get their act together and say, we need to defend ourselves. Instead, we're just going to steal like crazy and not defend the country. And boom, they didn't defend the country.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking about carrots, one thing I think for Singapore is that we see, because it's now viewed as a relatively corruption-free and serious about taking these issues, there are a lot of multinationals that are moving their Asia offices to Singapore. Yeah. So that's another sort of incentive that can have an impact on a country's willingness to take these issues seriously.
Thanks. Over here.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the unanticipated consequences of some of the anti-corruption efforts, in particular with FATF and anti-money laundering. You may know that de-risking is a huge problem, particularly in the humanitarian assistance area, but also for small companies. The number of banks that no longer have corresponding banking relationships around the globe, I mean, it's remarkable how it's been reduced by 2/3, I think, or something. And are there actions that both the U.S. government and international institutions can take to try and protect those institutions, whether it's small business or humanitarian aid organizations?
You want me to do that?
Bill?
Well, that's interesting. Public policy can often can often be consumed by one guiding principle to the exclusion of others. So it takes a long time to get to our planes. We're spending, for example. So some risk can all of a sudden loom as the most important thing we need to deal with, and we won't really pay attention to other risks. I'm not sure we've reached that point with anti-money laundering and foreign corrupt practices, but I am concerned that, or an issue that exists is that if in Latin America, for example, access to credit is a problem. So access to credit has been a big problem in Latin America for a long time, and then when you throw any money laundering restrictions on banks in Latin America, you don't make it easier for them to extend access to credit to local citizens. You may not make it more difficult, but we don't actually know. So I kind of feel in this narrow sense of access to credit and anti-money laundering, we need some research on that. What are the trade-offs? Because it's okay to say, I mean, it's normal and human to say, okay, this is the risk I most care about. Nobody wants to fall out of the sky, right? So it could be one chance in a million of falling out of the sky, but that's really a bad one. So I won't even. So and it could be that corruption is in that category, and the things that anti-money laundering is meant to prevent is in that category. But it at least should be an informed decision. I should at least be willing to say to myself, yes, I'm willing to wait an extra hour in the airport, and I'm willing to spend an extra hundreds of dollars in tax money every year, just to reduce my risk from 1 in a million to 1 in 2 million. So that's it.
In the back?
I'm an artist who had a fracture of my ankle for 6 months, so I've been watching a lot of TV. What I want to say is that I remember when Crazy Eddie, Enron, all that stuff kind of got pushed over, and then everybody, and here's what I'm thinking, that American values is like a game, you know, to be able to be corrupt. I mean, if you look at what we're doing on TV, NCIS and the news, the general news, do you think that that could be changed in terms of normalcy if, like you said, people would be on the side of humanity instead? Like if there was more promotion in the media, like we had our own channels like Charlottesville Public Access TV and all that sort of stuff. More people were, you know, doing the heroic things to anti-corrupt. But really, people see America kind of like Donald Trump, you know, getting away with it. What do you think?
Kara.
Okay, so I will say that I think it is absolutely a problem, because I think that as Phil said, the language that we use, the examples that we hear, what we're teaching our children, what we're saying about what we expect from American society matters. I like to think that we're not that fragile and we're going to come out of this and hopefully come out of this stronger. I think the examples that you gave, for example, Enron gave us the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which in the security space really changed the way that companies had to be careful in their accounting. So it was a good thing. The financial crisis gave us the Dodd-Frank Act, including the Whistleblower Act, that now have significant protections for whistleblowers and a bounty in the U.S. So I think good can come out of bad things. I think right now we're just in a very challenging moment.
Thanks.
I'm just going to say, so the dilemma we confront is the more polarized a society is, the more likely voters will give a pass to politicians or whatever who are kind of deviating from the norm. So it's kind of a vicious circle.
I think we have time for one last quick question in the back.
Thank you. Earlier in the previous discussion, as well as in the one that we are about to conclude, oh gosh, 1 minute. Can you please explain the context of what the Panama Papers are and how they play a role in terms of international corruption?
Yes, sure. Okay, so for anybody that follows this, the Panama Papers are actually fascinating. It was so there's a law firm in Panama called Mosaic something that was hacked. Exactly, that was hacked, and basically all of their files were released. There was a consortium of journalists, so this is actually a really interesting story about how journalists can shape a story, that got access to these papers, German, American, international, and these papers demonstrated how this firm was an incredibly prolific firm at setting up shell companies in Panama. And they had the information on who the beneficial owners were, not all the time, but some of the time. And this became a huge story, and it is still out there. The wealth of information that was released in the Panama Papers, and then later the Paradise Papers, which I think came from the BVI or the Caymans, one of the Caribbean nations, really shined a spotlight on how frequently these shell companies are used, and not just by other corrupt countries, but by people in America.
With that, I'm afraid we're out of time. Please join me in thanking Kara and Phil for We're going to take a short break of 15 minutes. Please, if you file out, there's a box lunch of the very best kind of food waiting for you. Please come back in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.